Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today in this fireside chat. My name is Hank Schless and I'm a Senior Manager of Security Solutions here at Lookout.
And I'm Mike Banic, and I lead marketing for Lookout.
So today, Mike and I are going to be talking about zero trust and how to take a more pragmatic approach to zero trust, help cut through some of the noise that's made in the market about it, and give you some actionable items on how to really make this process a little less complex.
Yeah, give you some good things to do Monday morning, easily actionable.
So Mike, let's start off by setting some context here. This year, President Biden signed a couple of executive orders that really focus on zero trust, and I'd love to get your input on how that affects how both the federal government and enterprise organizations can think about security as a whole with kind of a focus on zero trust there.
Yeah, so I think of zero trust as becoming a charged term. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I want to share my perspective on zero trust. I think zero trust is really about reducing the risk that people have by limiting the attack surface. And when I think about a good example of what I might have experienced in the past, before we had guest wireless networks in companies, I remember a company I worked for, we had Ethernet ports on the conference room table. And we had a vendor come in and we said, oh, you need to get on the network, just plug into that port, and they could see everything. And so really, when in that context, what it means about reducing risk, reducing the attack surface is, let's provide somebody access, but let's give them access to what they need without risking what we value. And so President Biden's executive order is really valuable because it raised zero trust to the national and international stages. As we talk to customers outside the United States, they're clearly paying attention to what we're doing with it and how we're building architectures that are practical for people to deploy. And so as we look at these architectures, they're very applicable to the future of work. They're very applicable to the fact that people can be productive anywhere. They don't have to be productive in an office. And in the past, we architected a security perimeter based on the assumption that people would be in one place and the apps and the data would be in a data center. And that's no longer true. Not only are the employees productive anywhere, but the data has moved into SaaS applications like Salesforce and Workday. It's moved into infrastructure as a service as organizations took an app out of the data center and moved it to Azure, AWS, Google Cloud Platform. And they want to make applications easily accessible to the employee with a direct user to app connection with things like zero trust network access. So zero trust in President Biden's executive order is applicable to all of that. And again, I like to think about it as reducing risk, reducing the attack surface, providing the access people need without risking what they value.
That's well put. I like that. That's a good way of putting it, for sure. So looking at the history now, so we've set the context here. Let's look at a little bit of kind of where zero trust started and where it's going now. So I think as most people remember, it was introduced back in 2014 by Forrester. Since then, the way that organizations architect their infrastructure has changed, the way that we work has changed, but there's still value in the core of what zero trust was introduced as. So the three main, core principles of zero trust at the start really were that you need to secure access to the network or to your networks, regardless of the location. And the other one, which is actually what you were just saying with the Ethernet story, you need to ensure that users only have access to what they need. And then the third one was to inspect and log traffic. So now, since 2014, we think a little bit about what's changed, right? So now we have apps and data moving up into the cloud. As you mentioned, everyone's starting to leverage or is aggressively leveraging AWS, GCP, and Azure. You also have the fact that data is just fundamentally structured differently, right? And the way that it's accessed is fundamentally different. And then finally, you have the real threat, which is that the way that, from mobile devices all the way up into the cloud, the threat vectors themselves have fundamentally evolved, and the ways that we protect against those in the context of zero trust have also changed.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, John Kindervag, who I have a lot of respect for, drove a lot of the initial zero trust research, published that for Forrester. There's a good friend of mine, Neil McDonald. He wrote some He wrote a piece for Gartner called 7 Imperatives for Deploying Zero Trust with a CARTA-based framework. And I forget what CARTA stands for, but it's continuously something...
Assessing
risk, trust,
food,
assessment.
Yeah.
But there's one thing I remember Neil writing about that is in those imperatives. One is that you have to continuously assess the risk profile of the user, the device, and the apps and the data that they're accessing. And that really directly maps to tools that people can deploy in their zero trust architecture. Mm-hmm. And, speaking specifically to Monday morning actions people can take. Yep. So, tools that people can evaluate and deploy start with things like user behavior analytics. And that speaks to continuously assessing the risk profile of that user. Mm-hmm. Are they doing something that's out of the ordinary? Does it represent a risk? What is the level of that risk? How does that actually change the access that you want to give them without risking what you value? The second is around the device. And here, this is where the focus is around collecting the right device telemetry that can be analyzed to determine, has the risk profile of that device changed? Mm-hmm. And then lastly is the context of what is the content they're trying to get to? What is the sensitivity of that data that they're trying to get to? And all of those 3 things come together to help make dynamic zero trust decisions. And I'll just give a couple examples. So if I'm a user, and I'm not doing anything abnormal, but the risk profile of my device changes. And let's just say it goes from low to medium. And there's a few different applications that I'm accessing that, the enterprise organization cares about. And, but one of them is, it doesn't really represent a high risk level because maybe there's no personally identifiable information in there, no private health information in there, no intellectual property. But then another one is chock full of that stuff. Maybe it's our Salesforce instance. Mm-hmm. And so as that risk profile changes on my device, you want to take advantage of your understanding of the data sensitivity. So, that first application that doesn't have any sensitive data in it, I still have the same access, still reading and writing, using it. It's not impeding my productivity. But the application that's chock full of intellectual property and PII, you're going to shift my access profile to read-only because we don't want to risk what we value, but we still want to provide me access to be productive. Maybe my risk, my device risk profile, when it goes to high, that's when maybe you start redacting information. Right. Again, to avoid risking what you value. Mm-hmm.
So Mike, at the core of it, things have become more complex since 2014 when Zero Trust was first introduced. And I think what's happened is that it's created this feeling in the market that achieving Zero Trust is impossible, and I would agree with that. I think people feel that it's an unattainable task as everything changes around it.
I agree with you. I sense that myself. It's why I have actually put it in the context of Zero Trust is really about helping you reduce your risk. You can never eliminate risk, but you can get it to a point that it's acceptable and manageable. Mm-hmm. And as I think about it, a lot of people probably don't understand some of the things we talked about earlier, that it's got to be an integrated architecture. And it's why we're involved with the NCCOE, and we were selected by NIST to participate in that as part of the executive order. And, so to kind of suss that out a little bit, I have a couple questions I want to ask you. So, first, tell me a little bit about why just because a device is managed, we can't grant it just open trust to applications in our networks.
Device management is important, and that goes across all devices. And the challenge with that, though, is that if you're planning on allowing employees to use their own devices in a BYO model, device management isn't even a possibility in the first place. But then you have the complexity that you actually talked about earlier, right? Being able to understand the nuances of context and risk that only endpoint security can feed into your overall zero trust architecture.
Okay, so Hank, another one. Just because the user ID and the password are recognized doesn't mean that the account isn't compromised.
This is actually one of my favorite ones because I think it really speaks to a problem that will never go away. Even as the way that we access infrastructure changes, there will always be an element of identifying yourself. And I think that people will always find ways to exploit that, right? So the way I think about it is that there are so many ways to be phished. There are so many ways for credentials to be compromised and for that device, that account in turn to be compromised. And you think about it, right? We all get those messages, those text messages. We get the emails, we get the messages on WhatsApp and social media, and depending on what you like to do, gaming apps and dating apps. Like they're all different places that you can be socially engineered to either give up your credentials or compromise your device in such a way that the attacker can then see your credentials when you're logging in. And then basically they turn around, they go to their computer and they say, okay, well, what applications, what cloud apps, for example, does this organization use? We all are guilty of somewhere in our internet presence, a lot of times on LinkedIn, saying, oh, we use AWS and Salesforce and I'm skilled in these things and people endorse me for how good I am in this HR platform that we all use. And so the attacker goes and looks at that and they go and log into it and with your credentials and then suddenly they're in. And that's really why it's so important to have endpoint security integrated into your zero trust architecture. So Mike, let me flip it back on you now. I've got two for you. First one is, what does it mean to you when I say just because the device has antivirus on there doesn't mean it's free of risk?
The first thing I think about is a lot of cyber attacks don't involve any malware. If they're able to subvert the device or the user account, as you just mentioned, once they get on the device, the attacker can just live off the land. They can sit there, they can look and listen to what protocols are being used, how does you operate your business, and then use those things against you. They can use those same protocols to perform reconnaissance, to move laterally, to find data that's valuable, and ultimately exfiltrate that data.
All right, last one for you, Mike. So just because we know the user or the device, does that mean we can grant them unrestricted free access to everything?
Just because we know the user and the device doesn't mean that we should give them unmitigated trust, unrestricted trust. And that kind of comes down to the fact that the insider threat problem that we need to always be cognizant of. And I categorize them into the intentional and the unintentional categories. Okay. And there's actually a lot of, if you search on Google, you can find some great examples. One dates back to 2017, a healthcare organization called Bupa in the United Kingdom. They had an employee that went into their customer relationship database. They downloaded the information about the users that they provided healthcare coverage for. They deleted it, and then they attempted to sell it on the dark web. It affected 547,000 covered members. Wow. And in the end, the organization was fined £175,000 because it involved the inappropriate use of personal health information, personally identifiable information. And that's an intentional use case of the insider threat. An unintentional use case is well documented. 2019, Microsoft customer support database was actually stored in Azure. Somebody incorrectly configured Azure security policies and exposed the details about 250 million accounts. In that case, there was no PII exposed, so there was no fine that followed that. Right. But it happened at the end of 2019, just a couple of months before California put in place the CCPA regulations, which would have actually had a very different outcome because of the number of individuals that were affected, protected by CCPA regulations. And so in this case, in both of those examples, it's why user behavior analytics are so important to be part of the zero trust architecture.
So Mike, as we're coming up on the end of our conversation here, I think it's really important in the spirit of what we've been talking about today and sort of clearing up what all this noise around zero trust really means and coming back to those core principles. I think a really important thing would be, how does Lookout define zero trust? What's your definition of that?
At Lookout, we believe that zero trust is about enabling organizations to dynamically implement policies across users, devices, applications, and data that mitigate that risk and put it in a controllable form and takes into full account the context of the user and their device, as well as the sensitivity of that content, and have the dynamic policies work in context with both of those. Now, as we look at this, it's important to start with the endpoint. Support any operating system, any device, be able to have that contextual awareness at the endpoint, to be able to protect data wherever it resides, whether it's in a software as a service application like Salesforce or Workday, whether it's in an enterprise app running in infrastructure as a service, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Platform, or an on-premise application that's being cloud enabled. And then lastly, that we do it in a way that doesn't hinder productivity. So we make those decisions about what are the security policies to implement relative to access without risking what we value that are specific to the risk profile of the device and the specific application. So if my risk goes up on my device, I can actually only get read access to critical data in one SaaS app, but I continue having read-write access, just in that example I gave earlier. And then lastly, there's no single platform that's going to solve every problem. Our goal with the Lookout Security Platform is to deliver a solution that puts our customers in full control, all the way from the user and the endpoint to their data in whatever cloud application it resides in, and allow them to implement that, implement the functionality as they need it, and have the convenience of, they define security policies once,
right,
and they define them in a single console, and they can get their management reporting from a single place. We know that customers need simplicity, and that simplicity also brings with it reduction of human error, and it helps them make more use of the staff that they have across securing a broader set of applications to achieve zero trust.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, Mike, it's always a pleasure to sit down and chat with you. So thanks so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation very soon. Have a good one.